I think the European Union elite does not speak for the European public anyway. We have seen whenever there is a major attack on Gaza, for example, there are large-scale demonstrations here in Brussels and in many other European capitals. There is a lot of public support here, I'm proud to say, for the Palestinian struggle for equality and justice and freedom. That unfortunately that is not reflected by the positions taken by European governments. The European governments do not speak for the people of for their own people when they decide to embrace Israel tighter.
Israelis took to streets in protest of the current government decision to make judicial overhaul, accusing their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his entourage of putting Israeli democracy at risk, as they call it. But they don't reject their government's murderous crimes against the Palestinians and stealing their land and demolishing their houses. Can human rights and democracy be divided? It's my pleasure to ask this question to our guest, the editor of Electronic Intifada, activist David Cronin from Belgium. Welcome to our program, Mr. David. Mr. David, we saw thousands of Israelis taking to the streets protesting Israeli Prime Minister's decision to make judicial overhaul, saying that this would harm democracy in Israel. Can we consider this as a split in the Israeli society, or his decision to freeze that ended the problem there?
That's a very interesting question. Well, it's a split between two groups of racists. Let's put it in very blunt terms. There are the very extreme racists that are now part of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government, people like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who make no secret whatsoever of the fact that they want to kill Palestinians, burn their villages, etc. And then there are the more softly, the more kind of, perhaps the more polished racists, some of whom actually took part in the protests. People like Benny Gantz, the former defense minister in Israel. Benny Gantz, it should be recalled, has probably killed more people than most of the current members of the Israeli government. He was the head of the Israeli military in 2014, I apologize, when Israel carried out a massive bombardment of Gaza. Benny Gantz actually tried to turn that fact to his advantage when he went into electoral politics. He ran campaigns boasting of how he had, in his words, returned parts of Gaza back to the Stone Ages. So this is the kind of split that we have, that we are seeing in Israel. It's a split really between two racists and two groups of racists, and of course we should remember that all of them are committed to a deeply racist ideology, the ideology of Zionism, the ideology under which the Palestinians were dispossessed.
Yeah, and do you think that the decision of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday to suspend the judicial reforms, as he calls them, do you think that he ended the split between the two parties?
No, I don't think he's ended the split. No, the split has been there for some time. I think he has taken a decision to temporarily save his own skin. I don't think he's done anything more. It's clearly something that he's done under pressure from the West, particularly the United States, and also under pressure from
Yeah.
an important constituency within Israeli society.
Yes, and a follow-up question, Mr. David. We saw how the United States administration, many European countries, were very interested in what was happening in Israel. In what context do you understand this interest by the European and Western governments in general?
Well, we just need to look at the way the European Parliament framed this issue a short while ago.
Yeah.
Earlier this month, the European Parliament had a debate which was titled "The Deterioration of Israeli Democracy." Now, that presupposes that Israel is a democracy. Ilan Pappé, the well-known Israeli historian, has probably explained this issue best when he described Israel as a Herrenvolk democracy, which means a democracy for the masters only. Israel has never been a democracy if you are a Palestinian.
Yeah.
If you're a Palestinian living under Israeli military occupation, you have zero democratic rights as far as Israel is concerned. If you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you have some token rights, the right to vote and so on, but you are treated as a lesser equal to Jewish Israelis. Unfortunately, the European Union, the United States has nonetheless gone along with the official Israeli version of events and treated Israel as a democracy. The New York Times today repeated the cliche about the lie, basically, about Israel being the sole democracy in the Middle East, neglecting to point out that Palestinians have never benefited from this so-called, the supposedly vibrant democracy.
Yes.
that Israeli propagandists are always celebrating.
Yes, Mr. David. But we see the structure of the current Israeli government, including Ben Gvir and Smotrich and their followers, the Israeli settlers living in colonial settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. And we saw the settlers' violence against the Palestinians, mainly against the Palestinians in the region of Nablus in northern occupied West Bank. They are acting like thugs, like hooligans. The Israeli forces are protecting them. We saw just yesterday burning Palestinian cars, breaking Palestinian houses' windows, injuring Palestinian citizens. So to what extent such behavior by the Israeli settlers and the support they receive from their government would change their Western governments and Western public idea about Israel to be not seen as a democracy as they think?
Well, you're absolutely right. These people are thugs. But in my opinion, and I'm sure many Palestinians I don't claim to speak for Palestinians, but I have plenty of Palestinian friends who would probably agree with me on this point. The so-called Israeli liberals are also thugs. They probably wear nicer suits than the two men you have just mentioned, Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben Gvir. Excuse me. But they are essentially thugs. You had a prime minister last year. Israel killed more Palestinians in the West Bank than it has done since 2005.
Yes.
Yet, and that was under that was at a time when for most of the year, or for a large part of the year, Yair Lapid, the so-called centrist, the king of centrism in Israeli centrism, was the prime minister. He was foreign minister as well for part of the year. He is somebody who has seduced, for want of a better word, the European Union. There was a sense of relief here in Brussels, I guess, when Netanyahu was briefly removed from power in 2021, and when a so-called liberal government, it's debatable whether the term really applies at all, but when a liberal government was formed, Yair Lapid, who was then foreign minister, came over to Brussels very soon after his appointment in 2021, and I've seen documents based on meetings that he had, European Union documents following reports on meetings that he had with the European Union elite, and the term used was that there was now a new window of opportunity following the Netanyahu years to improve relations with Israel, but that there should be some concrete progress in the so-called Middle East peace process. The only real progress, there was no real concrete progress at all. All that Mr. Lapid did was that he made a speech at the United Nations in which he declared his support for the so-called two-state solution. But that was enough. That was just a tiny crumb, but it was enough for the European Union. And based on that alone, on that very, very small statement, the European Union was prepared to ignore all the violence that Mr. Lapid was overseeing in the West Bank and in Gaza. It went ahead and it did what was something that was regarded as symbolically important. It revived the so-called Association Council between the European Union and Israel, which had been moribund for about a decade, more than a decade.
Yes, and Mr. Cronin, sorry for interruption. My final question to you now. You mentioned the EU and the American administration mantra, their support for the two-state solution, of course, lip service, no actions on the ground to implement that. But in light of the current escalation by the Israeli settlers who are given the arms and given all the support by the current government to harm the Palestinians, to steal the land, to kill, to do everything bad in the occupied Palestinian territories, don't you think that this will weaken the Israeli ability to publish its narrative in the European community? I'm talking about the European public now. Forget about governments.
Well, I think the European Union elite does not speak for the European public anyway. We have seen whenever there is a major attack on Gaza, for example, there are large-scale demonstrations here in Brussels and in many other European capitals. There is a lot of public support here, I'm proud to say, for the Palestinian struggle for equality and justice and freedom. That unfortunately, that is not reflected by the positions taken by European governments. The European governments do not speak for the people for their own people when they decide to embrace Israel tighter. And if I could just finally point out, I said that there was a brief improvement in the atmosphere between the European Union and Israel in 2001 and last year. But it should also be borne in mind that the European Union has actually deepened its relations with Israel during the many years in which Benjamin Netanyahu was in power, but it did so in a very secretive and sneaky and non-transparent way. For example, there was a lot of cooperation in so-called security areas. There was cooperation between the European Union and Israel's racist police force, for example, that increased quite considerably during the Netanyahu years. The Israeli police force is actually now considered a strategic partner for the European Union. That's something that was decided while Netanyahu was in power. So even though the European Union elite prefers the so-called liberal Israeli liberals, they are still quite happy to do business with the hard right as represented by Benjamin Netanyahu. It would appear that the gentlemen, I use the word in inverted commas, needless to say, that you mentioned earlier, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, these thugs in ill-fitting suits, are probably gone too far for a lot of what they're doing is obviously not palatable for the European Union, but many other forms of Israeli violence
yes,
is acceptable, unfortunately, for the European Union leadership. Not for the people of Europe, but for the European Union leadership.
Yes. David de Koning, editor of Electronic Intifada, pro-justice, pro-the rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And from me, Osama Nazal, have a nice time.